First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really always nice to come back here. And I remember the last time I was standing here was EmTech student. So it's nice to be here again, showing what happened so far. So I'm here today to talk about bio-inspired kinetic structures. One of the main research topics at the ITK in Stuttgart, which is an engineering institute within the Faculty of Architecture, led by Professor Dr. Jan Knippers. We at the institute about 15 PhD students working on all kinds of stuff. So one of the tracks is, as I mentioned, the kinetic structures, segmented shells, wood construction, and fiber binding. So one of the main research topics is related to fabrication method of fiber composites in general, where we have a strong collaboration with the ICD from Professor Menges in Stuttgart about coreless fiber binding. So how can we use robotic fabrication methods to create fiber composite structures without the use of formwork? And there are several examples. I want to show just a few here now. The Research Pavilion 2014-2015, where we had a pneumatic formwork and a robot, a KUKA robot, placed inside an air-inflated bubble, and it was placing fibers from the inside on the membrane. And also now more applied projects like this fair stand we built a couple of years ago for the University of Stuttgart to present our research at the trade fair in Hanover, where we had also a KUKA robot at the fair which was showcasing this whole process. And the other main track where we use fiber composites are those adaptive applications based on elastic deformation of the material, where we have also quite a few research projects, and a couple of years ago also the thematic pavilion at the Expo in South Korea, which brought this approach to actual architectural applications. So if we talk about adaptivity, it means adaptivity means that having the ability to change to suit different conditions, which is a common phenomenon in biological systems such as evolution, or changing its appearance to hide for predators, or also insects use forming strategies to adapt material and adapt the whole structures to their colony size and to their needs. And especially in plants, we can see a lot of movements in the plants to serve different means, for carnivorous plants to feed or to follow the sun, or to minimize their surface during night to be not that obvious, to not be eaten, and so on. So for adaptive architecture, one could argue that every architecture should be adaptive, and it has to be adaptive to suit different conditions also during the day to different needs of the user. But as adaptive architecture, we would understand maybe more structures or systems which are designed to can actively be altered to serve different needs in either their environmental conditions or structural behavior or programmatic use. So there are also a lot of examples which reconfigure space, or in the center we can see the Elytra Pavilion done by ICD and ITKE last year here in London, where the movement of the people was tracked during the installation and influenced where we would place the next component based on the movement patterns, or the smart shell, which is done at the ELEC at the University in Stuttgart, which uses this active support points to counteract vibrations in the shell. Therefore, the shell can be much thinner than it usually should be. So if this structure starts to vibrate, those support conditions counteract this vibration and stabilize the whole structure. Another main topic of adaptive systems right now in architecture, facades. So can we control the environment inside of a building by changing the opacity of the building? But most of those systems right now are based on straight or planar components, which are guided along straight rotation or straight translation axes. This leads to very tight design constraints. So if it comes to more complex geometries, like here this example done by Renzo Piano and also Knipper-Selvig engineers, that if you have double curved geometries, those systems are not applicable anymore. And due to the high mechanical complexity, they also, in areas where they still can be applied, they need to be mounted in the inside, which leads to less efficiency for sun shading. Then there are membrane structures, which can be basically adapted to more complex, or to a higher variety of geometries. But the disadvantage of those structures is that they can be either open or closed, and the in-between state is very vulnerable. So the state needs to be changed very fast, and there are only two stable conditions. Then folding structures, which are more applicable to curved or double curved geometries like the Alba-Harthaus by Aders, shows the potential of penalizing those structures into in a different way, in a new way, but this example relies on rigid body mechanics. Each of those panels is made of high amount of different parts, and that also leads to vulnerability. So that's the background, or the reason why we study this bio-inspired kinetic architectural applications with the use of compliant mechanisms. So compliant mechanisms are in engineering or in craftsmanship in the human history nothing new. So for example, those bows use also compliant mechanisms, which means that they use an elastic deformation of the involved parts to fulfill a certain functionality, in contradiction to rigid body mechanisms, where rigid parts are linked together with basically frictionless joints. We focus on how can we achieve functionality by functionally distributed materiality to concentrate the deformation in parts we want to have. So that's also a huge research community which applies those things for grippers, for robotic grippers, or for design research center of Disney. They're working on a method how to create a movement path and then to arrange basically material in a way that it follows those movement paths. And bio-inspired compliant mechanisms are studied in Stuttgart already since 2007, when Dr. Risa Martini started with this topic at the University in Stuttgart, which was followed by the dissertation of Simon Schleicher, while Risa Martini followed more or less a top-down process that he defined architectural functionality and tried to abstract movement principles found in nature. Simon's work was more the bottom-up approach, where he really tried to understand the movement principle in plants and simulated those movement principles with finite element analysis, and also tried then to abstract certain parameters. So what we are working on right now, and what my PhD research is focused on, is how can we establish a design framework for compliant mechanisms for adaptive architectural functionality, and how scalable could this be, and also on finding suitable materializations for those things. So while commonly those structures found in nature are categorized in a very biological way, so based on how can the movement be produced, and is it turgor pressure, or is it an external actuator, or is it a movement of muscles and bone structures. We right now try to implement more a technical view on those classifications and how these movements can be amplified so that a small initial movement leads to a larger change of the geometry, and also if we can change the direction of curvature in single elements. So that leads to this overview that we define our biological role models, and at the same time we define, try to work on the technical descriptions of how those biological systems would behave, or how they alter their shape, to categorize them in a new way, and also then to help designers to say, okay, I want to have a certain movement or a certain degree of freedom, in which kind of biological systems I could find them, and then how they basically utilize for this movement. So first of all, we want to look into the bending behavior of those systems. There are several ways how we can manipulate how a structure bends. So if we just bend any sheet of material or a rod, it always follows the elastical curve, but if we start to alter the material distribution, we can differentiate the bending behavior also by the way how to actuate them, at which point we introduce contractions or displacements and control points manipulates the bending behavior, and also how we fix the boundary conditions if they are rotational free or if they are fixed in certain points, and so on. So we can manipulate a lot of this. This leads then to what can we do with this if we can manipulate the bending behavior. Where I want to show some slides of the master thesis of a student of mine from last year, Jan Brütting, who his research was focused on how can we assemble bending active segmented shells, not limited anymore to the elastical curve, where we can see that if we have a isotropic, uniformly deformed, distributed material along our plates, it will always follow the elastical curve. But if we distribute it in a way, we can basically design our surface and arrange the material according to our design criteria. So here in theory, it would be possible that we even can bend an arc, that we go from basically zero stiffness to very high stiffness. It doesn't follow anymore the elastical curve, but we can bend a perfect circle, which of course in reality is not possible because we cannot have zero stiffness. But we can broaden the design range quite a lot. So we can see we can draw the curves we can see here on the left side, and then distribute the material along our strips according to the needed stiffness. And this then based on a lamination process or tape laying method, where we have discrete elements along our strip, and we can orient the fibers in a way, and the thickness and the amount of layers to fit exactly our design criteria, and we can bend a lot of shapes. And at the end, he developed this design tool where a user can create a free-form shell structure in rner. Then this surface gets discretized into strips, which are made developable by planarizing the quads along the strip, which is followed by the stiffness distribution. Then this whole thing, to prove the concept, was exported to a finite element analysis program here, Sophistic. And we can see if we then just pull basically the endpoints of the strips to the final positions of the structure, we bend almost exactly the shape we designed. And if we force then the strips together, we really reach the surface, and we overcome also the weakness of bending active structures in general, that they need to be flexible enough that we can bend them. But we achieve in this way a very sufficient shell structure. And another master thesis on a similar topic was done by Kenryu Takahashi. He basically investigated the scalability of bending active kinetic plates for roof constructions, and he made a lot of experiments and analytical and simulation studies on how we can scale them by altering the support conditions, by how can we add torsion into the element that we bend those systems out of plane to create an opening and then closing, and tested them under certain loading conditions like wind and snow load, and basically he came then up with each of those systems with this on the one side supported cable actuated structure we can see on the left, a range of size we can use a system like this, then the undulated strip in the middle and the cable supported plate on the right, which would be large enough to span a distance of 45 meters by just actuating or contracting the cables below those plate structures. Then, as mentioned before, another topic which we are investigating is the motion amplification of the system, so meaning we only have a small displacement in a very discrete position, and this should lead to a large geometrical change, where we especially try to define the methods where we can find concepts in biology which are very closely related to curved line folding or to straight line folding, for example in insect wings, or to lateral torsional buckling, like in this Strelitzia. We'll show it later in more detail. Again, we abstract the principles, how we need to distribute material, if the whole surface is bending, if the whole system is bending, or just in local areas, and how we could actuate them. And those systems then get in the next step translated to fiber composite structures together with our partner institute in Denkendorf. And now I just want to give an overview about the research projects in this field we are working on. So it started off with this Flectofin, which was done already years before I arrived in Stuttgart, which, as I mentioned, was based on this Strelitzia regina, where a bird is landing on this stem of this flower, and then two petals open due to the bending deformation of this stem, and so those petals are connected to it. As we can see in the bottom row, basically, if we bend this rod, the plate buckles to the side, and this is the whole secret behind it, basically, that we have this GFRP, this glass fiber rod with lamellas on the side, and if we introduce bending into this rod, the lamellas open to the side. So that's the usual process. Those concepts are investigated, that we have the whole model. We try to figure out the kinetic behavior of it with simulations, and then we translate it, and we work on the applicability to more complex geometries rather than to flat surfaces. But this Flectofin had some challenges which we needed to overcome. So the materiality of this element is very much homogeneous, and this leads to very high stress concentrations and also to very high actuation forces. So that's why we were looking into how can we create similar systems but with very distinct hinge zones, which were flexible, and we could reduce the stress concentrations and also reduce the actuation forces, which led to the development of the so-called Flectofold, where we again work with biologists in Freiburg together and with the material developers of the ITFT in Denkendorf to finding solutions in nature to develop systems with distinct flexible hinge zones. And one of those examples would be the Aldrovanda vesiculosa, which is a underwater carnivorous plant, genetically very closely related to the Venus flytrap, but the movement is based on completely different behaviors. While the Venus flytrap has this snap-through buckling effect, in this example, the whole motion is triggered by bending this midrib, and then the adjacent lobes close. So if we have a closer look, that we can see that there's a zone which is very thin and similar to a fold line, to a curved fold line, so which led us to the investigation of curved folding, which is nothing new in design and studied already at Bauhaus and in various applications from art objects to car design. But what was relatively new is how can we use this for kinetic systems. Then to understand the kinematic behavior of the systems, we needed to define and to study the parameters, the geometric parameters we can change to manipulate the bending behavior, the closing behavior. We developed a kinematic model based on the reflection plane method, which says that if we have a curved geometry and the fold line would stay within one plane, we can use this plane to mirror the surface and approximate the curved folded geometry. So in our case, that means that in the midrib, we introduce a bending deformation, and based on this bending deformation, we can simulate or approximate the folding behavior of the system. So, as we can see here, we have a very close relationship of the radius of those fold lines to how much displacement we need, or how much bending deformation we need, how much actuation we need, and so on. So in short, you can say that if we have a smaller radius, we have larger displacement in our control points, or in our support points, but also higher curvature, and this higher curvature could be used for stability reasons. So if we have a higher curvature in the elements, we gain more geometrical stiffness, which is, especially if we are looking on facade shading systems, very advantageous than related to wind loads, etc. And in the next step, then this models get, so that while the kinematic model gives us only insights of the geometric relationship of all those parameters, but we don't know the structural performance, so we don't know how much force we need to actuate them. We use this model and translate it into a finite element model, where we apply glass fiber reinforced plastic material properties and different thicknesses to this different areas, the flap, the midrib, and our distinct hinge zone. And we also can simulate the actuation force, which in this case now would be a pneumatic cushion, which is placed behind the midrib to introduce the bending to the midrib. And then again, we can make a study with different radius, different hinge width, etc., to see how much force we need, how much curvature we really get, because it gets not one-to-one propagated along the hinge, etc., how the hinge is bending, and so on and so forth. And then we can make the study, we can zoom in, define areas where we have high stress concentrations, so if we may change the geometry slightly in these areas, how we can reduce this. And another important aspect is how different actuation methods also could influence the one hand the bending behavior, but also the stress concentrations. As we can see here, the first graph shows the deviation of our structure, the simulated structure, to the purely geometric model. So the kinematic model with this perfect arc-like shapes, how much our bend geometry differs from this. And if we go to the second row of graphs where we see the stress concentrations along the hinge, we can see that we have they're quite corresponding, and where we have large deviations of our perfect geometry, we also have very high stress concentrations. So the next step here would be now, how can we adjust the actuation forces to get closer to our kinematic geometry to reduce the stresses, or how we can rearrange the material in a way that we compensate for this better. Then the next step was, how can we really materialize this? And then in another track, we were investigating the wing folding patterns of beetles, which basically some of them in a really very sophisticated pattern are able to fold their wings beneath their forewings, and also with a very local actuation they unfold them very rapidly, and even they are very small, they can take quite high loads with very, very thin materials. And then we were looking especially closer to the fold lines. There are basically two ways how to reduce the stiffness in those fold lines. So in short, it's the thickness of the material, but also the composition of the fibers and the protein matrix in these areas. Then with, again, collaboration with our material scientists, we were able to develop material layer, again with glass fiber reinforced composites and elastomer layers to create those hinge zones, which allowed us to even enlarge the structures to have this folding behavior. So at the end we can say that this element took the geometric principles from one biological role model, the curved folding system and the bending of a midrib, and how this gets propagated to this large geometrical change of the whole system, while the materiality or the abstraction of the materiality came from a completely different biological role model. So it's not a translation one-to-one of what we see in nature, but we take inspiration of different phenomena we find and try to recombine them. And this led then to this large-scale demonstrator, which was designed and constructed by my colleague Saman Safarian, which can be seen right now in Stuttgart at the museum, Natural History Museum. There's an exhibition about biomimetic in building industry, which goes till May, if anyone is interested. And each of those elements has now one of those climatic cushions, which bend this midrib, and by bending the midrib, the flap surface is folded. So then we were talking a lot about this geometrical adaptability of the system to complex geometries, and there we run into one problem with this curved folding element, because it always needs to have a certain pre-folded condition, so that we know that if we bend the midrib it folds in the right way and not bends just the whole surface. So we can tessellate a surface into quads, then we need to make slightly anticlastic shaped quads out of those panels, and we can translate them into our component and form our flectofolds. So we use this as production data for fabrication. So again, we see how the surface is tessellated, how we need to adjust slightly the surface and to populate it with these elements, and then we have our kinetic facade system. But as I said, this always needs this prefold, and we need to alter our geometric condition. So therefore we are looking now for ways how we can start from a flat surface, or we can change the direction of curvature even. So one possibility would be to actuate the hinge itself, so we can start from a flat condition, and by actuating or inducing our bending in the discrete hinge zone, we can go from flat to curved. Or if we have two actuators in the hinge zone, we either even can change the direction, or we change the geometric variation, which leads to the element on the right, where we basically just rotated the whole system by 90 degrees and actuated the edges of an underlaying mesh, and added these curved folding elements, where we also can go from a synclastic to an anticlastic surface without altering the surface, which we then built as a prototype in a workshop last year in Tehran. And also what is interesting to mention here is that we don't have any stiff connections to a fixed substructure, but we have this sort of compliant connection points between our complete substructure. So if we shorten those edges by inflating them, the whole deformation is compensated in the edges, and we don't have any moving parts in the whole system. So we just tested the whole system on a, again, double curved surface. We tessellated into a triangulated mesh, and did some experiments on how can we optimize the structural system, populated with our element, and by then bending the edges, the facade opens and closes, which then was built. So as we can see here, when we inflating the actuators, the size of each edge changes, but we have not one single moving connection in the whole structure. And then the last topic would be the change of curvature direction, which can be also found in various biological role models. As mentioned before, the Venus flytrap, which has this snap-through behavior, basically as a speed boost to catch its prey. But for example, this fan on the right side undergoes a very similar geometrical change, but in a very smooth transition. So it's a question for the biologists how this can happen. So why the one snaps through, the other one not? For us, it's interesting because snap-through behavior is always accompanied by a very high release of elastic stored energy, which can be quite dangerous if you scale those systems up. And also the fatigue in the material is very high. So we were thinking how could this work, and we had an idea. So maybe the initial geometry of this fan is actually not curved, but it's flat, and by drying out or by collecting water by cell expansion in different layers, it can change its geometry. And we tested this again in finite element analysis, that we have a grid of fiber bundles and cells which can expand and contract, and we can see that in this way we can go from a flat to a curved position. And if you now have two layers of cells, you also can easily imagine that you can change the direction of curvature of a system like this. And this is quite interesting, because then you can imagine that you can inform also the geometry you want to achieve by the arrangement of your fiber bundles, and where you contract, where you expand, to control also the geometry between a system like this could change, which then again leads me to the master thesis of Lotte Aldinger and Giorgia Margheriti, who just finished 1 month ago their master thesis on tailoring cell formation, fabrication and simulation of membrane actuated stiffness gradient. So the idea of them was to place glass fiber or carbon fiber strands onto a pre-stressed membrane, and after releasing the tension, it formed a geometry. So inspired by a lot of projects which were done before, like the Adidas Futurecraft, which used the tailored fiber placement to manipulate the bending behavior to bend these shoes into a predefined geometry, or the active shoes at the self-assembly lab at the MIT, which use a similar principle. They print material onto a membrane and then releasing the tension, and it forms this. And the last example, which was developed here a couple of years ago by EmTech students and was presented this year at the ISS in Hamburg, which also used this pre-stressed membranes, and by cutting out certain areas of a stiff material to form sheets. So they wanted to take this work, or trying to build up on this previous work, which was done to basically define formation rules. So how really can we manipulate a pattern of those fibers to fit to a given geometry which we want to achieve. So they had this design intention. They did for more than 6 months a lot of physical and digital experiments on how we need to shape those cells to allow for deformation into synclastic and interclastic geometries, and then use this data based on the fabrication constraints of tailored fiber placement to allow for designing the surfaces in a synclastic and interclastic fashion. So as mentioned, they used then this fiber tailor placement, so they figure out the curvature in certain areas. They influence the how those fibers are laid up, how those cells are formed to contract in different directions. So they suit those fibers onto their membrane, applied the resin, let it cure, let it half cure, that is also important to say. Then they release the tension, it bends into shape, then it cures completely, and it gets a more or less rigid structure. And with this method, so at the top row we can see the design. So they wanted to design a synclastic dome-like shape, or this saddle shape. Then they applied their design rules and formation rules. And on the bottom row we can see that the physical results are actually pretty close to the design intents. And then also this works in combinations and transitions, and they also developed a sort of design tool that we can design this changes of curvature direction, positive and negative Gaussian curvature, and the pattern gets applied to it, and we're able to showcase this in a variety of physical examples. And with this I also want to mention that all the work we are doing is our PhD research, also the pavilions, would not be possible without our great and amazing EmTech students, which really bring a lot of input and work into our environment. And with this I would like to close and thank you for your attention.
Any questions? Thank you very much, first of all, for a very interesting lecture. And if there are any questions, please.
Not a comment, a question. Thanks very much for the presentation. On the last topic, you can manipulate two things. You can manipulate the type of pattern, and you can manipulate the amount of stretch you put on the membrane.
Yeah.
Will you explore both
Yes.
sides?
Yeah, they made, as I mentioned, I really showed this now very, very briefly, because we didn't publish anything about this so far. But they made experiments with a lot of different membrane materials, how much pre-stress, especially then in the simulation, how much elongation uniform pre-stress or directed pre-stress, different stiffness of the fibers, different densities of the fibers, different orientations. So
yeah, so I have two questions. One is that basically you use a lot of this by inspiration. So how this transition from biology to architecture is happening? You have your architectural ambition and then you are trying to find, let's say, the biological principle to it, or you're inspired by biological principle and then you apply it to architectural idea which can be suitable? That's one question. Another one, maybe it's quite dumb, but for the last project you showed, you have a diagrid, right, to change the curvature. What will happen if you will put a different pattern, like a triangle or a hexagon? Will it work? No? Will it change it somehow?
With triangulars, it doesn't work because then it locks.
Okay.
And so the quad-based patterns work quite well. The first question is maybe a bit more difficult. So I think it's also not possible to answer this in a very clear, short answer because it's forth and back. So I mean, we defining a problem and we are looking for a solution, but then we don't get a look at this plant from the biologists as the answer for our problems, right? So it's, I think in the day-to-day work, it's zooming in, zooming out all the time. So we want to find certain principles which enable a certain behavior, but then we have a broad range of systems which are doing this, some of them more suitable, some of them are less suitable. Then we analyze one role model, but cannot find, I mean, as I showed today, I mean, it's just, we cannot find the solution of our problem in one role model, but we can extract certain principles and combine them with principles we found in another role model. And that's also why so my personal work is related to identifying, or let's say somehow to put categories on those phenomena we find in relation to what we would need in a technical application. And discuss this then with the colleagues from biology. That also, which helps them to have a new or a different look into the biological systems, because they're looking into nastic movements or movements based on hygroscopic behavior. Yeah? But that movements which are triggered by this can be found also in certain animals, or can be found triggered by a completely different mechanism or for a different purpose, cross-links all of those biological role models as well.
One question, please. First of all, thank you for a very interesting presentation. Regarding biomimetics principles, you just mentioned hygroscopic movement. I wanted to ask, there seemed to be a trend moving away from using natural material to synthetics when applying biomimetic principles. Could you maybe comment about the material of choice? How come it is seen more from ICD and EmTech using synthetic materials as opposed to natural ones in applying biomimetics principles?
It's again a question which is, I mean, so first of all, this question, I mean, there are also two research tracks within the ICD and the ITKE. If we want to have active materials which get actuated by a hygroscopic phenomena, compared to having a system which is actively controlled by any sort of control mechanism. Then the choice of material that we use, technical composite materials, is based on the right now availability, that we know if we use certain materials, there's research done or they're proven to have certain parameters, but at the same time, Professor Hannah Dahi at our institute is researching into bio-based composite materials to replace those synthetic materials more and more with biological fibers or bioresins. So it's just research which goes in parallel on different levels. That right now we have this material. If we define how we can produce it with material A, we can use this knowledge to apply it to another material. But at this moment, we have basically not so much choice in the material components we can use for those systems.
For your pneumatic actuators, I take it that's an open system, as in it has to release, it has to exhaust the air, or you can feed it back into the system, like a hydraulic system.
In theory, it could be fed back, but that's not so. There's one inlet, but the air gets pushed out. So in this case, we have stored elastic energy in the whole system. If we release the pressure, the elastic energy is just used to flatten it again. So it's the nice thing on those systems. We have this climatic cushions, which are very light, don't need a lot of energy, and could use still quite high forces. But in the examples we show here, we are in the below 1 bar range. And we just need an impulse in one direction. We don't need a controlled movement. And also, what I showed with this example at the workshop in Tehran, that we also don't need this high accuracy of controlling each movement in a perfect choreographed way, because all these elastic parts working together allow for a distribution of those inaccuracies, let's say.
Just a question about the mechanics of it. In your research, are you also thinking about how these structures will be powered? Like how you will act, the movements, all of these things, what kind of energy you'll use to actually make them work?
Yeah, we do in general. It's not part of my personal research, but yes. So first of all, as I mentioned, we use a lot these pneumatic actuators because they don't need so high amounts of pressure.
All right.
And also, right now we are working on how to integrate different functionality in those elements, such as solar cells, bendable solar cells, etc. So to also gain again energy. Good.
Okay, cool.
We need energy to operate.
Yes, of course.